Hey, what's going on, guys? Bo here from Top Deck Cards and Games, and today we're going to be taking a look at a deck tech here for Black-White Angels, or otherwise Black-White Control for this season of Standard here for Eldritch Moon. So, the Pro Tour happened, Black-White ended up winning the Pro Tour. However, I am playing something a little bit different, like past what was actually played by the winner. So the winner was playing like a traditional just black-white control deck, whereas I'm playing the Angels variant that plays Gisela and Bruna and just kind of recycles value off of you being able to get dudes back from your graveyard with Bruna and just otherwise really just get a lot of value out of the cards that you play. So we'll break it down here based on the different cards that we play. So first we'll start off with the creatures. So I'm playing 2 Kalitas, 2 Gisela, 1 Thalia's Lancers, 1 Archangel Avacyn, 1 Linvala, and 1 Bruna. So with these cards, you're able to just kind of mitigate any damage that your opponent's doing in the early game. So whenever you're playing against like super aggressive decks, your Kalitases and your Giselas end up being great ways to gain back life. The Kalitas, of course, whenever you start killing stuff off, even if you languish and have the Kalitas die to your own languish, being able to kill off a bunch of stuff, especially in like a matchup like Bank Company and get like 2, 3, 4, 2/2 zombies out of the Kalitas is insane. And even past that, whenever you start being able to sacrifice the zombies and put counters on him, Kalitas ends up being just a powerhouse and being able to just kind of win very easily. Gisela is insane just because the Gisela and the Bruna, if you happen to just have them on the field at the same time and it goes to the end of your turn, they turn into Bracella, which your opponent can't cast 3 CMC or less cards. It has Flying, Vigilance, Lifelink, which is just insane, and you can just win a game basically by just having this out on the battlefield most times. Your opponent can find ways to get rid of it. It's not a perfect way to like win the game, but it definitely kind of closes out games a lot of the time. And against decks like Bant, they really can't do anything. The only cards that they can play are like Company and Avacyn, which they have to Company into a Reflector Mage, and even at that point, you pretty much just win the game most times anyway. So the Bracella is insane. Thalia's Lancers finds you any of your creatures here. So the Lancers is pretty good in like if you're in the late game and you need to get something back from your graveyard that your opponent killed. You can Lancers into Bruna. Bruna finds like if they kill your Lancers, you can get the Lancers back and then search for something else. Otherwise, Bruna will just get the Gisela back and you can meld. But getting a Linvala the Preserver or an Archangel Avacyn is pretty insane as well, just because the Avacyn is just a great blocker. It can pressure your opponent as well. And then the Linvala, because of the Enter the Battlefield trigger, you can either get the 3/3 off of it if you have less dudes, or getting back to 5 life is just broken at the same time. Lancers is definitely like one of the best cards in the deck, and just being able to tutor up for like anything is really great. You can also tutor for a Gyreach Sanctum, or Gyreach Sanitarium, excuse me, which is in the land base for our deck as well. And post sideboard, I play an Emrakul in the sideboard, so you can tutor for the Emrakul and just win the control matchup pretty easily. Like that's just one of the surefire ways that you win is just by having the Emrakul there and just wasting your opponent's stuff. And itself, the fact that it's a 13/13, it has protection from instants, and you waste your opponent's turn is just like, it just closes out the game for you. Now for the Planeswalkers of the deck, we're playing 2 Liliana, 1 Ob, and 2 Sorin. So I initially was playing 3 Lilianas whenever I was playing in the Star City Games Regional in Ohio. I like the card a whole lot, but it's a little bit clunky whenever you start playing 3 of these. Especially like whenever you're playing the Angels and whatnot. So it seems like a card that you need to have 3 of whenever you're playing all of these dudes, because you're foddering stuff into your graveyard with the plus ability that you can take something back. So like let's say you mill off the top like a Bruna and Gisela, you take the Bruna back, you cast the Bruna for 7 and get your Gisela back. But when you start seeing this card in multiples, like it's less good because chances are your opponent's going to try and do everything that they can to get rid of one of these, and you're already going to have the responses to be able to stop them from doing anything. So I really actually didn't like having 3 of these in the deck, so I cut it down to 2, and I've been loving it as a 2-up so far. There's not really a whole lot of instances where this card sides out. Sometimes I might side out like one copy of it, but usually this card's great against aggro just because you get to make your opponent's dudes smaller with the plus ability. The minus ability, of course, lets you get back dudes from your graveyard, so it lets you just win the attrition war in terms of playing against other control decks and other like grindy decks. But if you ult it, like, chances are you're just going to win. It's not a perfect win every single time whenever you ult. There are a lot of instances where your opponent can just kind of get around the tokens if they just don't do anything quick enough. But the ult is definitely a great way to curve out into a win, which happens quite often. Because if you're able to play her, protect her, and especially against like decks like the Rug Emerge deck, they can't really interact with this card, and if you just ult, you're pretty much just winning. We have one Ob Nixilis Reignited, so Ob is really good at just dealing with a bunch of stuff. Like, you can deal with opposing Brisellas, you can deal with Emrakul. Just being able to draw cards off of him is just insane as well, and this is a card that I just win the majority of my games with. Like, ulting this card is pretty much how I just win a whole lot of the time, just being able to smash my opponent by like the game actually playing itself out, making them lose life because the game is playing out. And with Gaia Reach Sanitarium, you can actually pressure your opponent even more because of how much is going on with both players drawing cards. So the Ob Nixilis is just absolutely insane at dealing with cards and also being a powerhouse ult. And Sorin is basically the other way to win with the deck. You're not really winning with your creatures. The creatures are just kind of there to help you not lose the game, whereas the Planeswalkers are pretty much what you owe most of your wins to, the majority of the time, I've found. So the Sorin, the plus ability, of course, is just going to be smacking your opponent for a whole bunch of damage just because you're playing cards like Bruna in there, and even after you sideboard, like revealing an Emrakul is literally the most broken thing you could have happen. But being able to get extra cards into your hand and making your opponent lose life for you getting those cards is great. The minus X is another outlet for you to gain life, and the ult, you're never going to do it. Don't ever do it. Usually, you end up having your opponent just board wipe you. If you're playing against a deck that like doesn't play any type of sweepers, no Radiant Flames, no Languishes, Kozilek's Returns, anything like that, you're probably okay and safe for it. But usually, most of the time, like if you're playing in like higher level competitive events, that is like not going to be something that's ever going to be like what you want to approach. Like, you never want to ult this card. You just want to keep on ticking it up. I've played quite a lot of games with this card where my Sorin would be at like 12 loyalty, and I just never ult it because getting the value off of the +1 is just always better. But usually those games I'm also having to face off like where I know my opponent has like a Languish or Kozilek's Return in hand, so I actually can't even use it. But my Sorin has been over 9 numerous times that I can count. Alright, so that's the Planeswalkers, creatures. The spells, they're much more straightforward. We don't have to talk very much about them. They just do what they do. We just have to read them from top to bottom, and they're good. So we're playing 4 Grasp of Darkness, 2 Ultimate Price, 1 Hallowed Moonlight in the main, 2 Transgress the Mind. Sometimes I have to stop and remember what cards are called because most of my cards are foreign. 2 Ruinous Path, 1 Stasis Snare, 2 Anguish Unmaking, 3 Read the Bones, 4 Languish, or 3 Languish, excuse me. I was playing a 4th one before, and 1 Descend upon the Sinful. So Descend is by far like the best card out of like all of this. I like this card a whole lot, and a lot of decks aren't playing it. Just being able to get rid of a bunch of awkward things, being able to get rid of awkward board states where your opponent might have spell callers and stuff like that in the late game. Being able to descend is insane. It doesn't die to an Archangel entering the battlefield or anything like that. Any triggers, Selfless Spirits, things of that nature. You can get around Emrakuls if you top deck it, or if you just have it in your hand and your opponent doesn't waste it for you. So there's just a multitude of things that Descend is good for. Also, because you're dredging with Lily, you're going to be putting a variety of different types of cards into your graveyard, so this is great for you. So you can actually get the Madness off. Or not the Madness, excuse me, the Delirium for it. Delirium is actually like almost always active in late game with this card, and even if you don't get the Delirium off of it and get the 4/4, the card's just still great. Grasp is just good against like everything in the format right now. The only thing that it sucks against is like the Emerge deck main board. But even still, you get to kill their Pilgrim's Eyes and things before they get like huge incremental value off of it, like where they just get to have a bunch of mana untapped and then get a Elder Deep Fiend for like super cheap or something like that. So the Grasp is really good just at dealing with a bunch of stuff. Ultimate Price is much more narrow, but still pretty good at dealing with threats in this format, especially when you play against decks like the Angels deck in your game one. Hallowed Moonlight's good against opposing Brisellas. It's good against any of the token decks that you might run into randomly. Green-White's kind of not in favor anymore, but you still might like run into that deck. I've mentioned Brisella, tokens, and Company. Yeah, that's like the other thing that this card's really good for. That's the reason to play it, is just you get a free card against Company that cycles itself otherwise. But just the fact that it cycles itself and you have the mana open, at any point in time you can kind of judge what deck you're playing against and whether you actually need this card for anything. And then in an opportune moment when you know your opponent's not going to do anything, you can just Hallowed Moonlight at the end of their turn. The two Transgressors are great for any of the slow decks. They obviously side out for any of the like super aggressive aggro decks. Two Ruinous Path to get rid of creatures, Planeswalkers, any problematic things. Usually you want to just keep these Ruinous Paths for Planeswalkers in various matchups, or keep the Ruinous Paths for Emrakul's. You wanna isolate your cards that can deal with a variety of threats for the cards that you can't like use your cards for. Like I can't use an Anguished Unmaking on an Emrakul, so I'll waste this card on like other stuff. We have the one Stasis Snare again. It's like for Emrakul, but this card's also good for Gideon as well. That's the reason why I play it, is because it deals with Gideon at instant speed. So it's kind of like my third Anguished Unmaking for the matchups where I have to deal with Gideons. And you're just able to flash it in and get rid of a animated Gideon, which is just insane. The two Anguished Unmakings, because dealing with problematic like Planeswalkers and otherwise like creatures that you want to exile, halves of the Angel combo is really good with Anguished Unmaking. Usually you don't care about losing the 3 life. Obviously in the aggressive matchups you side these up because you don't want to be playing a card that loses you life to get rid of something. And then you have better cards in your sideboard anyway. The 3 Read the Bones for just winning attrition. Like this card's literally insane in the mirror match. The 3 Languishes, which get cut for any like the control matchups really, and they're just amazing to have against like decks like Company. And we mentioned the Descent. The Descent's just good against like every deck, honestly. Like I never cut this card. I've never yet once cut this card out of going from like game 1 to game 2 against anything, even against aggressive decks. Sure, it costs 6 mana, and like it's gonna take like literally forever for you to cast that card. But you have like dead weights that you side in for the aggressive matchups, so the Delirium is a much more real thing anyway. And chances are your opponent's probably gonna rebuild their board, and being able to wipe their board and then get a 4/4 is pretty insane. All right, so those are our spells that we play in the deck. The land base we'll quickly go over. It's 4 Shambling Vents. 4 Forgotten Sanctuaries, 4 Caves of Koilos, 1 Sanitarium, 7 Swamps, and then 6 Plains. So pretty straightforward, 26 lands, 34 spells in the deck. And then we will take a look at the sideboard here, because the sideboard, I'm actually pretty particular about what I want for the sideboard. I don't necessarily like to play stock sideboards by any means, in terms of like what other people are playing. I like to play a lot of very obscure cards that just end up being good in a variety of different matchups. Like Gideon, of course, is just like insane, and the guy that won the Pro Tour was playing 4 Gideons in his sideboard, which I also agree with. This card is good enough to play in the main board, but it's just a matter of metagaming. Because if you think you're just going into a format where you're just playing against a bunch of slow decks, Gideon is what you want to be playing in your main board, because that's exactly where you want this card. Any of the slow matchups where your opponent is just siding in like hand disruption and whatnot, and is just trying to match you 1-for-1 on like removal and exchanges in card value, Gideon is where you want to be, just because on the first turn you get the 2/2 out of it regardless, and then from there on you're swinging for 7 every single turn, and if your opponent can't answer that, that's a problem for them. I have another Anguish Then Making for the matchups where your opponent plays a bunch of Planeswalkers. That's honestly what I have it in there for, is Planeswalkers and like any of the legendary decks. So if you play against like Sultai and they have like Ishkanas and stuff like that, you don't want them to you don't want to kill their board with like a Languish and Lily. So one of the common things is you Lily plus up and target their Ishkana and then Languish their board and just get rid of everything. It's kind of awkward when your opponent just keeps on grappling and playing the Ishkana over and over again because you don't really get to clear any gaps. Sure, they're like spending an entire turn doing that, but you're also just kind of like not doing anything. So cards like this are really good at dealing with anything that would recur. We have the one Emrakul. Emrakul is literally insane. In the control matchup, that's the card that just wins you the game usually. There's like nothing that your opponent could really just try and keep back. Like especially if they're like tapped out for their turn, you just go for your turn. You have the 13/13 on board that can't be targeted by stuff, and chances are they probably have something on their board that you can waste their cards in their hand for. So you can just make them have a absolutely abysmal one turn and then have them take another turn, which is just going to be subpar for them. Emrakul is definitely the way that I win the majority of my control matchups, is they go into the long game and then I just win with Emrakul. Speaking of Emrakul, I have infinite obliterations for my opponent's Emrakuls because that card is really awful to have to play against. So against the any of the like emerge decks or anything else that's just playing the Emrakul, you want to have the infinite obliterations, but especially for emerge, because if you obliterate and take their Emrakuls, if they don't see their Coaxes or if they don't play Coax, then you're just winning that matchup entirely. But just having the infinite obliteration, knowing what your opponent has in hand, and then being able to take all of their Emrakuls away just lets you get a kind of easy pass into winning the game entirely. Otherwise, to kind of continue with like the cards that we have for more grindy and control-ish decks, we have another Bruna. So against like slower decks, you bring another Bruna because your opponent's going to kill your stuff. You're just you're aiming for it. You know it's going to happen. So you sign in another Bruna, that way you can just recur things, you can recur your Angels and whatnot. I actually don't like Gisela all that much going into like Game 2, Game 3s against the control decks. I think like Gideon's just a better card in 4 mana for you. However, I do keep at least one Gisela in at all times against like those control decks. So the Bruna ends up just being good and allowing you to recur stuff. You can recur your Linval, you can recur your Avacyn, which Avacyn's also insane in the matchup as well. So the Bruna just allows you to fodder more, and it itself being a 5/7 for 7 with flying and vigilance is like just great stats. We have a Planar Outburst for a variety of different things, and it's another card that deals with Emrakul. It's another card that just deals with board states against things like Company. It's not perfect against Company. They play Selfless Spirit and they play Avacyn. However, you can really catch your opponent with their pants down with this card and then just wipe everything. It's also another Awaken a card, so with Awaken you can just turn a dude into a 4/4 and then be able to just pound them with the 4/4 itself. A lot of times what will happen in control decks, I'll always side this card in because you can just clear a gap, turn a dude into a 4/4 and then hit a Planeswalker. And usually that's what happens. Like my opponent will go into their late game where they just kind of like tap themselves out on a board, maybe play like a Gisela Gideon, uptick Gideon, or not uptick, zero the Gideon, make a 2/2, then pass, and I can Awaken in the late game for 8 mana, have a 9th land that turns into a dude, and wipe the board, hit the Gideon, and then just like pass turn, which is insane. Like you literally just get rid of their board for that. Planar Outburst is really good. Awaken is very relevant, and destroying all non-land creatures is just super insane. We have one Duress and one Transgress to Mind. Both of them are kind of separate in their implications. Duress is really good against the decks that are just going to be siding in like negates, any other counterspells of that nature, on top of playing things like Grapple and other spells that would otherwise just get casted like instant speed against you to just stop you. It's good against Planeswalker decks, of course. We was playing like 3 of them before, cut it down to 2, and then cut it down to 1. I don't like this card all that much. I wasn't previously playing any Infinite Obliterations, and then started to play more as I found that the Rug deck is a little bit more awkward to navigate around. Even in matchups where I would have my opponent like cast 2 Emrakuls against me, I would still end up winning. But it's much easier when you have an Infinite Obliteration and you just get to strip your opponent's deck of the good cards they're actually playing. We have 2 deadweights that we play against their aggressive decks, which also adds towards our Delirium for our Descent Upon the Sinful. And the last but not least card that we have is Blessed Alliance here. So with that, you are able to untap a dude for yourself. You can gain 4 life, and you can make your opponent sacrifice an attacking creature. So with the modes on that card, usually what you're going to be doing is using it as a gain 4 life at instant speed spell, which it seems so awkward and seems awful, but it's actually not that bad against like the aggressive decks. It's also cool because if your opponent happens to like Bounding Crisis one of your guys, or like your guy enters the battlefield tapped off of a Thalia or something like that, you can untap it with the Alliance and use it as a blocker for the turn, especially with like Gisela. Gisela is like insane to have as a blocker because it has First Strike. So you can manipulate combat damage and combat math that your opponent is figuring based on your board being tapped or anything like that. But gaining the 4 life, making your opponent sacrifice an attacking creature is also pretty good. This card's, it's like the weakest card in the sideboard, but it's also like a really strong card against the aggressive decks. Just being able to gain the life and manipulating what your opponent is actually factoring in their math. So that is my deck tech here for Black-White Angels, Black-White Control, whatever you want to call it, for this standard season. This is probably what I'm going to be playing all the way through the rest of the season. I can't imagine I would be playing anything else. I like all the rest of the decks. I just think this is the one I'm most comfortable with playing against any of the matchups and any of the decks that currently exist. So thank you guys for watching. Be sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel for more content, more various things to come, and until next time, peace out.